Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Woman in Between podcast. I am so excited for another episode, another solo episode with you guys, wrapping up our boundaries series. So, we're actually just going to dive right in. So, this is part two of our boundaries series. In our last episode, we got into our boundaries in the first place. What is the impact of not having boundaries, and how does how does it affect our own emotional state? How does it affect our relationships? And diving into, I guess, some of my chaotic life scenarios to hopefully help you identify, some areas where you want to improve your boundaries. But this episode, when we talk about boundaries, I wanted to talk the strategies around setting boundaries, discussing certain techniques and tips, and then the boundaries that we have with certain relationships. I think that's where a lot of us utilize the boundaries that we've created. That's where we have had our boundaries crossed. So, what do boundaries look like in the different relationships that we're all encountering? When we left off, and I was talking about how lack of boundaries have affected me, my emotional state, and just the level of stress, and also not having healthy relationships with the people that I care about most. And for me, all of that came to a head to where I wanted to establish those relationships and the boundaries that I've created, because boundaries do change over time. One of my areas that I'm focusing on boundaries is overextending myself to the wrong people. And that is something that I work on when it comes to romantic relationships, friendships, work, anything. But when I was feeling the frustration of my lack of boundaries, and especially seeing that I wasn't fulfilled in a lot of my relationships, and even just unhappy with myself, I had to really take the time to identify areas specifically do I need to focus on, and how is this impacting me? So, like I said, there's different relationships that you can have issues with your boundaries. You could have really great boundaries when it comes to your family, but struggle when it comes to boundaries at work. You can have great boundaries at work, but struggle to have boundaries in your romantic relationships. I think it comes down to identifying your areas, opportunity, so you can focus your efforts and understand how it's impacting you. I think we all have strengths in certain areas that we do well, communicating our boundaries, being consistent in our boundaries, validating them, and we see those relationships thriving. But then we have other avenues where we're like, this is not fulfilling. I'm not enjoying this experience. I'm not enjoying this relationship. And it's in a completely different area of your life. So when it came to my own boundaries, a lot of it was with, family relationships and romantic relationships for me. And even friendships. And it was just different themes that were presenting itself based off of different expectations. And with the main one being overextending myself in relationships that aren't serving me, or not with the right people, or it's not in the right situation. I had to focus on creating boundaries that would either weed those people out or block those sorts of experiences. And so I focused on my friendships, any romantic relationships that I had. That's the only place that I focused on. I wasn't necessarily having those issues at work. I wasn't necessarily having those issues with my family. The way I was being impacted from a friendships and romantic relationship standpoint was I was feeling drained. I was feeling used. I was feeling unworthy, unheard. And it was just impacting my sleep. It was impacting my mental state. And that was the biggest area. So that's where I focused in on. So identifying which area of your life you are struggling in, or you want to see improvement in when it comes to your boundaries. focusing on that and gauging how it's impacting you to determine where you even need to look. That's all about getting to the root of the problem. I think making this blanket statement of I'm going to have better boundaries is going to have you frustrated because you don't know where to direct those efforts. So spending the time to get to the root of the problem, and a lot of the time, like for me, it takes journaling, and I have to literally break out the areas of my life. We all have areas of our life that we're focused on. We have our family, we have our friends, we have our work, we have our hobbies. We all have these areas. And for me, it is journaling, blocking out all of those areas, writing a list of what I enjoy, what I'm not enjoying, what I want to see improvement in, and almost like a SWOT analysis. Like, do a SWOT analysis on your life, and that'll hopefully help you determine where you need to focus your efforts on creating what type of boundaries you need based off of the relationship that you want with those people or in those places. And then I think another part of that is once you have that area identified, the next question is, are your expectations realistic? And we talked about this a little bit in the last episode, where, for example, me overextending in relationships that aren't good for me. So I had a friend where the relationship was very much one sided, and we had very different definitions on what friendship was. They also lacked some boundaries. And I didn't feel like there was loyalty in some areas. Like I would need help in certain situations and they would go ghost, but would expect that from me. I was expected to pick my phone up whenever they called, but that wasn't the expectation to them. And it felt like a very uneven relationship. On top of, they would say a lot of disrespectful, passive aggressive comments to me. And when I looked at that relationship, of course I wanted it to be as like, well, I want, a relationship that is more reciprocal. I want a relationship where I am heard. I want a relationship where I'm receiving the same support that I'm giving. And what I had to ask myself is this person actually capable of that? And a lot of the time you won't know. You communicate your expectations and you give them the time to show you if it is or if it isn't. That's my recommendation, because people are always going to show you what they're capable of, and believe them. And I even think that is the environments that you go into as well. Like, we'll use work for example. When you interview with a company, you're interviewing them just as much as they're interviewing you, and you are telling them what your expectations are. So if you walk into that environment and it's not what you've expected, it's not the experience you want, you're going to sit down with your manager and you're going to reiterate what you thought you're walking into. And if it's not meeting your expectations, you're probably going to start looking for something because you've given it an opportunity. Another example of mine is, I think when it comes to co-parenting, you are constantly having to manage what your expectations are. And for the longest, I expected, my kid's father to do X, Y, and Z. And it caused so much contention because, like, well, this is what it should look like. This is what I'm expecting. This is what I'm wanting. When in reality, it's like, no, they're just not capable of this. Like, you've expressed it, they're just not capable. And sometimes it could be like, that's just not who they are. And so I think you have to, that's where the communication piece comes. But I think asking yourself, are your expectations realistic for the situation or person that you're dealing with to set both of you up for success? And then, right, that leads into the third point, which is the change is going to happen you. I've always been one of those people where, like, I will just let people kind of just do them, right? Let them, like the whole let them theory. I'll just let you, and I'll let the relationship just die off on its own without even expressing what I need. And at the end of it, I'm confused as far as like, well, why did this not work out? What happened? Because at no point did I communicate what I actually needed. It was almost like this silent expectation I created that this person had no idea about, and I'm not even showing good faith in the relationship to communicate it. So even if someone was capable, because I'm not communicating that, well, guess what? Nothing's going to change. And so having the courage to express yourself, which is a hard feat. Like it has taken me years to get to a place where I'm comfortable saying what I don't like, what my expectations are, what I need in a relationship, because for the longest, that was labeled as a problem. And I am still unlearning that behavior in every relationship that I have. But I have seen there's a level of respect that you can give a person by having a vulnerable conversation about what you need or what you're wanting to see out of the relationship or the scenario. And you leave with more self respect for yourself. It's a learning opportunity for you. And it also sets that other person up for success, and it gives them an opportunity to learn about you. And so I feel like my relationships this past year, especially with my friendships, whether it's romantic or not, I have challenged myself to just have open dialogue and be comfortable expressing myself, because nothing's going to change if I don't say anything. And here's the thing, if there's a problem with you saying anything in the first place, they're not for you. The room is not for you. And that's when, if you have to remove yourself because you have done your work. You've done the hardest part, which is advocating for yourself. And a lot of us have learned to silence ourselves. So please know that in every scenario, that is a win. And so, you hear me talking about like, you need to communicate, communicate, communicate. And how do you communicate? Because I'll be honest, like, there have been times where I have let moments pass by where I was supposed to say something and I didn't. And then, of course, I have the conversation with myself in the shower about all of the things I would have said. I mean, I know I identify as Pisces and I know that's a trait, but it's not a fun feeling. It's not a fun feeling to wish that you would have communicated something because you have no idea, like, how it could have changed the circumstance. Now, if you've communicated to somebody before and it's done nothing, like, please don't hold your breath. Like, I'm not talking about like the hard heads. I'm just talking about, you haven't had a conversation. Let's end it. But then, the question is, okay, how? And the first thing that I'm going to tell you is consistent, 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 consistent communication. And I'm not going to cover the part about like, if you say you're going to do something, do it. We know this. Do what you say, don't say what you do. So if you have made a statement on what you need out of a relationship, let's say, in one of your romantic relationships, you're like, hey, I at least want to touch base at the end of our day, via phone call. If that's what you're setting the expectation, okay, you said it. That's what you expect in a relationship. But when that doesn't happen, be consistent with the messaging. But I also think we need to think about consistency in boundaries that we have across the different types of relationship that we have. So a lot of the same boundaries that we would have in friendship, we should have in a relationship romantically, and vice versa. Like, and I say this because I have found myself in situations where I will let guys pass for this, that, and the other that I would cut a friend off immediately for. And when we think about what a romantic relationship is, it is a friendship. And what I had to ask myself when it came to men that I was dating and how they were treating me is, would my friends treat me this way? Like the people that know me through and through, that I love to my core, would they handle me this way? And I can think of a situation where, at the time it wasn't working and I was talking to this guy, and I remember him telling me, after asking, like, oh, how's the job search going? You haven't found anything yet. And, made this kind of comment of, well, you could always come work for me. And my comment was, Well, no, I would rather not do that for a lot of reasons. And the next response was, well, how are you going to make any money? And I just remember one feeling put off by that comment, but also asking myself, like, would any of my best friends speak this way to me? Like, is this the conversation we would have? And being consistent across the board about my expectations and how I want to be handled in any close knit relationship. So it's almost keeping those consistent boundaries with everyone. Now, your boundaries might are going to look different between your friendships, your families, and work. But I'm saying if a relationship stems from a friendship, then the same boundaries that you have for a friendship should be in place for a relationship. And those boundaries don't get to be crossed because one you're romantically interested in and the other one that you're not. Like, you deserve to be respected in both of those relationships equally. And personally, if somebody can't be a good friend to you, I have a hard time believing they're going to be a good partner to you. So, yeah. Um, And then the next thing, obviously, right? Having that conversation, but I think it goes deeper. I used to just sit here and be like, no, this is what I need. This is what you're going to do. And I'm not going to accept this. And that comes across controlling. It comes across like you're not being compassionate to the other person. Like, sometimes it can't be as straightforward and curt, especially when you start getting into, those family relationships where you have break down maybe how certain actions are impacting you so that there's full understanding and respect to what you're saying. So now when I'm expressing a boundary, I am at least explaining where this boundary is coming from based off of our relationship, not past ones. And if it is a past one, making sure I'm being very clear on the fact that the boundary is related to who I'm speaking to at that point. So explaining the why, explaining how if there's an action that's happening that you don't appreciate, if situations are being created that you don't appreciate, explaining the impact, and then establishing what your expectation is, and then open the floor, try to understand, and try to have that conversation to get on the same page. And then the last thing is own it. I used to be so scared, and I still had to pray through this, so scared to say this is bothering me because, like I said, that has always been labeled as a problem in past relationships. And so it would terrify me, and I would have to seek a lot of counsel to just build up the confidence to express my needs. What I have learned is you cannot say the wrong thing to the right person. The people that love you and care about you are going to take the time to understand you. Own it. You deserve it. Because here's the thing, there's plenty of other people that have the audacity to speak up for themselves. So own what you say and mean what you say, because you deserve it and they also deserve it. And also so that they can know you're serious. You know, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. It doesn't have to be a stern conversation, but I'm just saying, being confident in the fact that what you're saying matters, what you need matters, and that you are deserving and worthy of that. And so then I think that really leads us to, what do boundaries look like in different relationships? We talked about how, the boundaries of friendships and relationships can be interconnected because one roots from the other. But our boundaries do look very different with work. We don't handle our coworkers the same way we handle our family, even though these companies will try to tell you that we're a family, but it's just different. So let's take some time to explore setting boundaries in different relationships. In the first half of boundaries, or the last episode, we talked about boundaries can be with family, they can be with friends, they can be with romantic partners, they can even be like with your relationship with technology, which I thought was an awesome addition. And when it comes to technology, for me, I one utilize my do not disturb function. That has been a game changer for me. Just as far as just blocking out noise during certain time periods of either the day or just my life. So I have do not disturb settings for when I'm working out, if I am with my kids, if I'm not with my kids, if it's during the workday, if it's on a weekend. I have different settings for what level of contact that I want to have. And that's with whether it's text messages, whether it's emails, whether it's app notifications. All of that is customized to protect my state of mind during those certain time periods. But it's not that easy to like systemize relationships like that with people all the time. Because yes, you can put them on do not disturb. However, like you still eventually end up having interactions at some point. And so obviously starting off with family, that is probably the most complicated one. Like, and I'm not even gonna lie to you, I've had to lean on my therapist to navigate a lot of the boundaries that I have with my family. And this also includes my kids, the boundaries that I have with them, because so much of it is rooted in whether it is like generational trauma, curses, or it is simply by, geographics or age, whatever it may be, it's rooted in something much bigger than myself. And so I always know when I'm communicating with a family member, whether it's my parents, my siblings, my kids, or even my extended family, I want to be very empathetic and sympathetic to where certain actions are stemming from, because there is always a root. And these are relationships that I highly value. And not to say that I don't value the others, but I think when there's a historic link there, you want to be mindful of that. So, like, for example, with my family, learned there's a certain way that I have to communicate with them. Like, yeah, we have to have those sit down, like almost meeting like conversations, but it's a space where everyone feels respectful. And even how I tailor my message and my needs is I want it to be as sympathetic and understanding but stern, because I think, talking to your parents is going to be different from talking to your friends or your boyfriend. Like, it's going to be a different conversation, but you still have to communicate clearly. So I do advise, if you're in that situation where you're having to create some firm boundaries with family members, I would try to get some counsel around you to help support the conversations that you're having, because there is a level of respect that you want to have in that dialogue. They're even understanding their background, and making sure that you're also being stern in what you need and that the message is getting across. So that is an overarching one. I know it can get even more complicated. Seeking counsel so you can communicate clearly and being able to understand the generational history behind the behavior so that you can have a respectful conversation, and still be respected yourself. So, next one is friends. So, like, how do you set boundaries with friends? And for me, I have multiple levels of friendships, and I think we all do, right? We have our acquaintances, we have our gym friends, or we might have a different hobby, friends from different hobbies, and what we share with them looks different. The things we do with them looks different, which means our expectations look different. So the best place to start, and I actually got this advice from my therapist, where she said, know what your definition of a friend is. In any scenario, what is your expectation of a friend? And you might have an expectation of what a friend is, and you might have an expectation of what an acquaintance is, and for me, I've tried to always put my friendships into categories, but it becomes hard when they become intermeshed in so many pieces of your life, which I've just noticed in the past couple of years, because I kind of stay in very similar spaces. Like, I'm at church, or I'm kayaking, I'm at the gym, and usually the people that I'm meeting in those spaces, like, they're at one or two of them, and our lives just become enmeshed. Or I've had relationships where they develop at work and there's this closeness and then they blossom even outside of work. But at the foundation of what I'm looking for in a friend, that is always true. I'm looking for consistency. I am looking for integrity, reciprocity, humor. Those are things that I'm looking for. Support. I really appreciate qualities of my friend. They all have giving hearts. They are caring people. They pour into you. And that is what I define as a friend. So anything outside of that scope is going to flag for me. And it's just going to come off as is just kind of like, oh, that's a strange way to move, because I do have like these very black and white competencies of what comes with friendship with me. My friends have very clear boundaries, and because for me, I want to mimic that. I want to have, the boundaries that they have. My friends are good with discernment. They are spiritually aligned, and that's important for me. And so every person I encounter, I'm not measuring them up to like my best friend. I'm measuring them up to the core values that I have for my friendships that are present. So the example that I gave, the guy that I was talking to and his response to me not having a job, I immediately aligned that to the conversations that I had with my friends that were vastly different. Where, it was more, how can I help you? Who can I connect you to? How are you doing emotionally? And let me just say this. Yes, I understand. You can have a best friend of 30 years and you've only been dating a guy for 6 months, but showing consideration and empathy and consistency does not require that much time. It's real. Is it in you? Is really the question. And yes, to a certain element, you need to build trust. So I want to keep that in mind when we think about what the definition of a friend is and how that segues into the romantic partners that we have. Now, obviously, it's rooted in a friendship and making sure that you have those qualities there, but it's also being open dialogue. I think that's where there can be some differences. I feel so comfortable talking to my girlfriends about anything, anything. However, if a man entered into my life, it does take time to build trust, to open up about my past, for example. Those aren't conversations we're going to have immediately. So there's some differences there, but it does require me to set boundaries to protect those parts of me. And so I think that's why it's so important to discuss what your boundaries are once that friendship starts to turn romantic. Like that's an entire conversation about what your expectations are in the relationship. One of the best things that I learned is discussing your boundaries is not supposed to be a relationship history lesson. And I had to learn this the hard way, where I would go into these relationships and I felt like for them to understand my boundaries, they needed to understand everything that I went through in my last relationship. So essentially, I would talk them through every way that I was mistreated in my relationship and why I'm not going to take that anymore. When in reality, I was telling them, like, I've accepted this behavior. And so, unless it's something like I do have, some pretty key boundaries, like when it comes to my kids, of like, okay, you're not going to be around my kids for this time period. And, this is why. But there are some other pieces of me where the boundaries are very stringent for very big reasons. And I will go into that. You have to kind of use your discernment on how much you're going to share, but just be mindful of going down the history route to validate every single boundary that you have, because regardless, like those boundaries are validated without the history lesson. So hopefully that makes sense. And then obviously the mutual respect, and it sounds so simple, but people can fake respect. And I think the key thing is, and I also learned this lesson the hard way, is if you've expressed a boundary to, and this applies to anyone, but for the sake of romantic relationships, If you're expressing boundaries and they're not being respected, and especially if this is happening in the first 6 months to a year that you're together, that person does not care about you. They don't. They don't. Truly. When we care about people, we at least want to respect their wishes. And if we feel like we can't respect their wishes, we're going to have a conversation about it. If you're expressing what you need or don't need, and he's doing the complete opposite, you need to leave. And I didn't. And I stayed around. And lack of mutual respect showed itself through the entirety of that relationship. And it was beyond the most exhausting thing. So that's it on romantic partners. I think that's all I got towards them. And then obviously our coworkers. I think that it's so funny in the office. You always run into just different levels of this where you have people that are so open to just sharing their entire lives, what they do personally, what they're doing on the weekend, what they're doing at night, who they hang out with, like, all of their business. And then you have other people where you're just like, I mean, I see them a few times a day and they go home. You're shocked that they have kids. You're shocked that they have this entire other life doing these cool things because they just don't share it. And I have been on both ends of that spectrum. For me, it just kind of depends on what stage of life I was in. Like 4 years ago, I was going through a divorce and I was just emotional and a wreck. And I had really supportive coworkers and I was just an open book to a certain extent. However, most people that have met me in the past 5 years, especially like colleagues, have no idea that I've been divorced. Like they have no idea about that part of my life, which I personally appreciate. And a lot of my dialogue now is very work focused. Like you might hear something from me about my kids if I'm, going to a play or whatnot, or, if I have a vacation coming up, but I'm not giving a play by play of my life because I'm understanding these are my coworkers, they're not my friends. Now, there are those rare occasions, I think we've all had them, where you just hit it off with a coworker, and I've had that happen, and I've had coworkers become just best friends because of that. And I think when you have that type of relationship, there's a level of trust that you have to have, and you do have to build it over time. Like usually that for me, it takes 1 to 3 years to build those type of relationships and being in different environments and trusting and feeling safe. But for the most part, yeah, I'm coming in, I'm coming out. We'll talk a little bit, and then I'm out. And then even the time management around work and how much access to yourself are you giving them. So I've had companies before where it's like every Sunday at like 5 o'clock, I know I'm going to be getting messages as after messages until 11 o'clock. And that's when I learned is like, this is not what I want to do. And sure, I'll check my emails, Sunday for like 5 minutes, but I'm not wanting to like chat back and forth with people. I will typically turn my notifications off on the weekend. I know that I'm going to check it on Sunday night. However, all I'm doing is using that to start my to-do list for Monday. That's it. I'm not answering any messages. I'm not answering any emails. If I happen to, I'm delaying all of those emails so it shows that I'm sending them the next day at a certain time. That works a ton. I have a lot of people that think I'm up bright and early at 8 a.m. when realistically I sent that email out last night. So I think there's a lot of little tools and tricks that you can use, but I think turning those notifications off when you can, determining when and what you're going to respond to, and just being mindful of the interactions that you're having with people because unfortunately, you just can't trust everyone. I know that we've ran through those quickly, and there's a lot of different ways to handle those boundaries across those various relationships. And there's also a lot of challenges and pieces that you have to consider. None of our boundaries are the same. My boundaries for my family are going to be very different from yours, and they're going to change even throughout the years. So you are the only one that is going to know what type of conversations you're going to be having, what conversations you should have, how those conversations should go. That's going to benefit you. But I think as much as you can communicate, right, in the best way, you can have the right amount of support helping you communicate, and you can be consistent, but sometimes your boundaries just might not be respected. And it doesn't matter how many conversations that you have, it doesn't matter how many consequences are being given, it's just not happening. I think there's a few ways to handle that in any relationship. Like, even when I think about the relationship with my kids, they are learning boundaries. And there are some days where, like, they're just not getting the lesson. I can't cut my kids off. I can't cut them off, but at that point, it might be okay, I need to get some resources in here. I need to lean on some support. So sometimes it might be getting resources, getting support, finding someone to pull in to kind of replicate a conversation that you can have, depending on the value that you have for that relationship. Right there, we all have relationships that we are willing to go to extremes for because of the value it places in our life, right? Like, I'm going to have certain boundaries for my family and the father of my kids differently than I would, a friend or an acquaintance, just based off of where they stand in my life and what that relationship dynamic looks like. But I think we also have to acknowledge the fact that, like, if it's getting to a point where you've expressed and you've communicated and you've done everything that you could, sometimes you just have to read the and leave. And that's with people, and that's with experiences, places. Like, sometimes it's really not for you. Sometimes you can't change it. Sometimes it just is what it is. And I think having the ability to identify that and move on is just as difficult as it is to communicate. My therapist tells me all the time, she's like, setting boundaries, adhering to boundaries, that is not easy. A lot of us don't want to lose people in our life. Relationships take up like the biggest piece of satisfaction for most of us. And to end a relationship or to leave an experience, like even leaving a job, is difficult because you're attached and it's comfortable and there's fear of what's on the other side of setting a boundary. It's a very difficult thing to do. And I hate when it happens. I always will overanalyze, well, what could I have done to keep this relationship intact? And I will question every little thing. I'll run it through like a VHS tape. Yes, I said VHS. And ultimately, like, try to convince myself of, like, no, but this could work. And I'll say this as somebody that has walked through it: staying in a situation or with a person that is clearly not respecting your boundaries is going to damage you. Point blank, period. It is just going to damage you. I'm saying that because I've been through it. I've put myself through it because I'm so scared of letting the relationship go, or what it would look like if I just let things be. And I've overstayed my welcome, and it doesn't in any of these dynamics. And we all have a threshold. The threshold for what we're going to take with our family is going to look different from what we do with our friends. The threshold we have for our romantic partners might sometimes look different than what we have for our friends. You have to determine of what that threshold is going to be. The level of disrespect that I would take, with maybe a partner, was nowhere near what I would take for a friend. So those had to level out. So thinking about what your threshold is, and if it does come the time where you have to walk away, being confident in the boundaries that you set, the goals and the focus that you have for yourself, that this is happening for a reason. And, I've had on my mind a lot is sometimes God will block things that we want or that we think we need. And we will try and overextend ourselves and fight for people and situations and places that we don't even need to be around. And I get it, because I know, like, when I have to go through those seasons where it's clear that God is cleaning house, I do question, like, is this me? Is it me? Am I the problem? Like, am I not, worthy of this love? And all of that is false. We know we are all worthy. And I think we're also not meant for everyone. Everyone isn't going to work for us. Every environment isn't going to work for us. And that's not saying that we're a bad person or they're a bad person. It's just what it is. As you're going through and you're looking at the areas that you want to define your boundaries more, you're thinking about your expectations, and creating consistency, being comfortable in the boundaries that you're creating, willing to fight for those boundaries and fight for that life, even if it means leaving some people or places behind. So I am just wildly encouraged for you, for me. This is definitely a season where God is cleaning house, on my end, and He's making me reestablish what I look for in my friendships and also the boundaries that I'm setting just for myself. We even have boundaries that we have to set for ourselves. Maybe that should be another episode. Let me know. But I am encouraged. I am excited as we all take the journey to create better boundaries to leading a more fulfilled life, and how we evolve those boundaries as we evolve as people. So I cannot wait to hear from you guys about your boundaries, what has worked for you, what hasn't worked, how your boundaries have impacted your overall health. So, yeah, if you like this video, if it has helped you in any way, please like and subscribe to our page. Like I said, we are now streaming on all platforms, and you can definitely follow us at The Women in Between on Instagram. And I look forward to engaging with you, and I will check you guys out on Tuesday.